afterwards, just in case anything happened during the meeting. Sure. Cool. So if you're both ready, I will release them from the waiting room.
Happy?
Yeah. There we go. And everyone's in. So hi everyone, welcome to the last session on Thursday of SU20 Digital. The speakers for this session are Nick Smith and Catherine Sullivan, and they'll be speaking to you about going further with the governance wheel. So I'll hand over to Catherine and Nick.
Thanks, Lewis. Hi everyone, welcome to this session. I think actually Nick's going to start this introduction, so I'm going to hand over to Nick.
Cool. Hi everyone. You just got passed over as someone starts beeping outside my flat, so that's the joy of where we're going. If we pop onto the next slide, Catherine, and just to explain where we are. Look, it's late, and you're busy working hard, surviving a global pandemic, so we're not going to take too long on this one. We're happy to chat. We're keen to keep the session short. We realise that some people are kind of zooming in. Some people, we believe, are phoning in as a kind of like drive time show on their car. So if Ryan Beasley's on the B4121, hello Ryan, that's great. But the point is there'll be a section at the end where you can contact us. So we're going to keep this quite short and snappy. We're not going to ask you for lots of engagement, but then you can chat to us afterwards or email us. That's where we're going on this one. I hope that's okay with everyone. Cool. So just lots of you know who I am, and that's great. For those of you who don't, I've been working in Students' Union governance for about 15 years as an officer and a staff member. I've also worked on the other side of things in terms of the university registrar on governance. I think that's quite helpful, so you understand what the university think of you and your processes. But I'm also a board secretary for 5 students' unions, mainly in London, but also Winchester as well. And I've been training several of you that are in the call now. Hi Benjamin, hi Harry, and that's me. But I'm not the glamour. The glamour is Catherine. So do you want to say hello?
I am style, you are substance, obviously. Hi, I'm Catherine Sullivan. I'm a former SU president. I am former staff of the Students' Union, NUS staff. I've been a trustee for 11 years, including chair of the board for 4, and I'm currently a primary school governor because I have loads of time on my hands and thought that was a really good idea to get into a sector I know nothing about. And that's me.
Cool, lovely. So what we're going to cover is a few bits. So talk about who invented the wheel. We're going to about the governance wheel. We're going to speak to some excellent spokes. We're going to go through each one, and we're going to really be concentrating on what is excellent in our view, and some suggestions for things that you can do for each of those 8 areas. We're going to talk about a really good first board meeting, and for you to think about what you can do when you go back to your September boards. And then we're going to have a section on reinventing the wheel and think about how you go forwards. And Catherine has requested that I say that I will apologise for the awful puns at the end of this session. I'm sure that we may get to that. We'll have to see how we're doing for time. Catherine.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about who invented the wheel. So the wheel that we're talking about is the governance wheel, which was came out of the Charity Governance Code, which was sector developed. So charity sector developed with a number of partners, the Small Charities Coalition, NCVO, a number of organisations who still run that as a sector accepted quality assurance mark. The governance wheel came specifically out of this, but developed by NCVO. And what's really lovely is that was then adapted by NUS and student unions alongside NCVO for the movement. So there's a version that's specifically, if you've not seen it before, for the movement. If you're an NUS member, you're automatically a member of NCVO, so you can access either version for free. And if you're not a member of NUS, you'd have to join NCVO as a separate member in order to do that. Do you want me to do this, Nick? That's fine. So speaking to the spokes, there are 8 areas of the governance wheel, but we are specifically only going to be looking at excellent level on all of those. So you can go right the way through from 0 to 10, with 9 and 10 being the excellence level. And that's all that we're going to focus on, because this is about going further. This is not doing the basics. This is not compliance. This is about really motoring through with your organisation. And we're going to give you some thoughts on each one as to what you could do, and then hopefully you'll have some comments about that at the end.
Lovely, thank you very much. So I'm going to start off with looking at foundation, and so I've picked out some of the stuff from the foundation on here, and some ideas of things that you could do. So whenever I do reviews of organisations, I quite often will ambush the trustees and ask them what their charitable objects are, and they look at me quite often quite blankly. And so actually, I think one thing you should be, if they are going to understand that students' unions, let's say to public benefit, are you doing things like having the charitable objects as part of each board paper? If a board paper goes to the board, what's it do in terms of advancing its charitable objects? They won't all do that, or some of them are kind of supporting, but actually making that idea key about how you're representing students, looking after their welfare, giving them exciting things to do. That, you know, if you're using the NUS standards, those are your 3 ones. You know, making that front of centre of your board papers on your front sheet, as well as any strategy. We're thinking about how they are kind of those ongoing efforts to remain informed. Back when I was an assistant registrar, one of the things that we would do is we'd send out every 2 weeks or so an email about what's going on in the sector, but specifically stuff to do with charities. So you could send those out. So making sure that you're contacting your trustees, not just 10 days before board meeting, but all the time. And in terms of trustees are committed to the SU, we talked about this quite a lot earlier on in terms of the session we did on the anti-racist board. But are you talking about your values front and centre in your recruitment packs? Are you emphasising those areas in the purpose? And just so, when I did some work with Now Give Something Back, which was a tool to help recruit lay trustees, lots of people would start off by going, hello, we're an independent organisation from the university, we're student run, and you'd go, well, that's fine and that's great, but actually what else are you? And kind of putting that front of centre, what are the values that make Sunderland different from University of the Highlands and the Islands, those being the 2 chief execs I can see on screen at the moment. So, you know, what is doing that, basically. So that was on foundation. Looking at organisational purpose next. So having the board set and monitor long-term goals. Lots of unions do this, but I quite like the idea of having the CEO report about being very much linked to those kind of strategic aims. Some of the unions that I work with, once they've done the chief exec appraisal, actually those kind of appraisal targets linked to the strategy come to each and every board meeting. And that's quite a nice way to keep that kind of focused, essentially. We will return to this theme quite a lot throughout this, because not unreasonably it's a big part of the codes. But this idea of the needs of students are paramount, and how they seek, how kind of their views are sought. There is, I think, for good reasons, unions sometimes suggest that democracy is over there and governance is over there and they never ever meet. And that's very problematic. And again, when I've done reviews with unions, sometimes I say to their trustees, well, tell me about what happens at student council or a general meeting. And they sometimes look at me as if I'm talking about a different organisation altogether. So how are the democratic processes used? Are there times where you're saying, well, look, we're going to be talking about this in our board in 4 months' time. Do we need to engage with students in any way about this? Are we using student trustees as ambassadors for the board in those meetings, not just relying on the officers to do that with their kind of multiple hats, like some weird kind of haberdashery, but actually are we looking at kind of student trustees leading on this? And one of my favourite things about, we regularly review the partnership work with the university. I would love it if I thought that Students' Union trustees were regularly meeting with boards of governors of universities. Your major funder and the organisation with the closest charitable objects of anyone else in the country right on your doorstep, and you don't get a chance to meet each other enough. And I think going for a summer barbecue with those people would be really helpful, and I think they would appreciate it as well, having been from the university side of this. I think they would very often love to hear more from their students' union. So that's something you could do, maybe once every year, maybe once every 2 years, but you know, getting involved with those people as well would be great. So looking at leadership, and you know, I think that actually Students' Union are much better leadership than most other organisations. I work with lots of monks, and they are constantly not making decisions, partly because they believe in divine providence, but also they just don't make a decision. That's really frustrating, whereas Students' Unions are much better at this. However, I do think there's an importance about this embracing of collective decision making. I certainly am quite adverse to the idea that boards should vote. I think you should be working to consensus, and you should take that slow time to get that where it's needed. Lots of students' union processes are about people losing. Most people will lose their elections. Someone wins a vote or loses a vote at student council. That is not what trustee boards should be about. So I think that's important.
And I think it's really important when you're considering the behaviours that go ahead in those meetings, because if you go in with a combative mindset, this is going to be where somebody wins and somebody loses, your ability to see another person's perspective, or to, I don't even like the word compromise somehow, because that somehow feels like it's a lesser than decision, but your ability to reach a better decision is compromised in its own right. Sorry to jump in there, Nick.
Not at all. Thank you. That's great. One thing's about kind of good records on decision making. It's quite often when I look at minutes of organisations, what I see is a focus on contribution, but not necessarily the decision and the debate that went on. I'm happy to provide anyone with what I think are solid minutes, but I do think if your minutes are basically going, we decided this, that's your first line, and then it is, and here's how we got to that decision. Because what I tend to see is a kind of shopping list of all the people that spoke and said something, and then, oh, by the way, we decided this eventually. But actually, if I'm looking for the records, what I want to know is what was your decision and what made you come to that? So that's far more important than knowing whether it was Rod, Jane or Freddie that gave a view. That's a cultural reference for some of you, but not many. I think there's also just on leadership, just as well, is about having formal and informal discussion spaces. I'm a bureaucrat who hates bureaucracy, and there are plenty of times where you need the boards to be kind of quite precise. But we are a sector that is used to and comfortable with people doing stuff in breakout groups, doing stuff with flip chart or that kind of thing. You can embed those in your trustee boards. It doesn't need to be the traditional structure of 12 people around a room, literally around a table. You could do something else. Okay, so there's that on that one. Now, integrity. Some of you have had my training recently will know that I like to do this, where I ask people if they've heard of the word integrity, and then I ask them to describe it. And I think that actually we should probably get more agreements about what integrity means. And I would highly recommend that if you are going to show integrity, you make sure that you ask your trustees what they think integrity means, and you get a shared understanding before you kick off, because it means different things to different people. I think you should actively discuss the boundaries of democratic processes and their complications. I think that you should talk about how those are useful and not useful in terms of the needs of students guiding you. But also talking about where there might be limits to that, and the fact is that some stuff isn't best described by 100 people in the room having a speech for a minute, a speech against for a minute, and then deciding. Sometimes it's about saying, no, we want a small number of people to look at this. When it comes to conflicts of interests, I slightly disagree with this, because I don't think you should declare and record always conflicts. I think you should just declare and record interests. So let the individual declare the interest and let the board decide what the conflict is, okay, and records both. So, again, in terms of minutes, quite often I see something saying, oh, there was a conflict. And you're like, great, so did you decide they could stay or go? What was that? So have that conversation. Sometimes you might say there was a conflict, but we decided that it wasn't a big one and we're going to authorise it underneath the regulations that we're allowed. That's fine, but have that recorded properly. And of course, the other thing is that, if you're saying that you want trustees to behave in a way outside the boardroom and within it that meets your charity's values, two things. First of all, again, what are your values, and are they front and centre of your board's papers, or are they kind of in a document somewhere on the shelf? But also, how is there an opportunity for people to exercise those values outside of meetings? How can your lay trustees demonstrate those values in your organisation if they only come to 4 meetings a year? So think about opportunities for them to be part of that.
And I think the other thing for that always strikes me is that if you are struggling to see how you could hold someone to account for those values, for example, if one of your values is fun, you might find that your trustees Like, I don't know how fun I am outside of a boardroom. I'm brilliant in a boardroom, but outside the boardroom, I'm maybe less fun. Like, maybe think about what those words mean and have that conversation. So like, as Nick said, they're not sort of sitting in a document somewhere, but it also might help you to refine what those values might actually be in the first place.
Brilliant, fantastic.
Oh, sorry.
So that's all right. So looking at control, decision-making, risk and control, I've only picked up a few things here. So I think sometimes, again, there's a danger that risk becomes one of the agenda items over there, but we don't think about it kind of in each area. So actually, are we talking about risk on each and every section? And that might be including it in the front sheet, but also, are we including it as part of the discussions and kind of, is it not just on the front sheet, but also within the paper itself? And the same on equality impact assessments. And look, the vast majority of board papers I see say none to consider on literally everything. And I think that we probably need to do better. I think that actually we probably do need to consider a bit more about whether there are equality impacts on some of the decisions that we make. And if we decide there's not, that's fine, but let's talk about the fact that we've talked about it rather than just assuming that there's not. That's cool. Written terms and reporting mechanisms. I am obsessed with delegation of authority frameworks. I love them. I really, really do. And I think I've seen some really good practice. If you fancy looking at Queen Mary University of London, not the SU, but the university itself, I think they've got a really nice delegation of framework. And doing it for something beyond financial. So whilst you definitely have something there that says these are your signing, these are your records for who can sign for what amount. So, you don't need the chief exec to get a pint of milk. That's fine. The receptionist can't sign off the building project. Okay, we've got that one. But what's the delegation of authority, for example, for health and safety? Everyone has a duty, whatever level, to report risks, that they see. That's one thing. But what about diversity? What about, student voice, how all of those things, how do you put those in? And I think you can do that quite nicely. And I'd like to see more of that. Great. And also in terms of the union's role as democratic involvement, again, let's talk about this. One thing I've already said about student and trustees is the ambassadors of the board at student council. So empowering and training them to do that. So it's those voices as trustees, not just the president. But also, I think there's an opportunity for the lay members to be present outside of an AGM. And some of you have got great websites that kind of update that as well. But where else can lay members be given a platform to kind of be profiled, essentially, and so that people know who they can come to? I think lay members do a really good job, and I've seen it a number of occasions where they have helped SABs do things like get good jobs, have kind of training and development, think about the next big thing. But do that for your other students as well. I mean, get them get your lawyer that's on your board into your law society and have them chat to them as well.
Yeah, I think the other thing about the risk of these angle of that is that where you have a historical clash between your democratic decision making and what's perceived as being the separate governance arrangements, often a thing that's heard is, oh, why do these mystical people over here in this kind of ethereal trustee board get to make these decisions? And partly it's because they haven't clocked the officers are on the board, but also because there's no connection with the student trustees and the lay trustees, and profiling them at things and getting them involved in things it can be really helpful. And every single lay trustee I've ever spoken to would love an invitation to varsity and your summer ball. So even if they can't attend, they're really great things to do for a number of reasons, I think.
Fantastic. I've used the analogy in a different way in something that the Association of SU Professionals did, and Steve Call, which about the behind the emerald curtain in the Wizard of Oz. But I do think we sometimes keep our trustees behind the emerald curtain over there somewhere, and we say pay no attention to what's going on there, and actually we should be putting them out a bit. And
then the students see them as the flying monkeys that are coming from the wind. Yeah. We're going to keep the analogy going. That's definitely a thing.
Cool. Catherine's definitely seen more of that musical than I have.
I've been in it twice.
So looking at board effectiveness, I think one thing that I had absolute joy the other day when I saw an email conversation between one of my boards, and one of the lay trustees suggested something and another lay trustee disagreed, and it was wonderful to see. There was challenge and debate and discussion, either over email. And I think actually there's something about saying there's an expectation of challenge at induction and training.
Yeah.
We expect that as part of the board for you to talk and and to grow from that challenge, and so that's an expectation. Thinking about, some of you do have kind of board reviews and thinking about how you can use that, and we'll talk about the wheel later on and going further in that context. But I think there's some personal actions here. When I do trustee induction with officers and student trustees, and again some of you in the room, you know that one thing that I ask is about what are you going to do in these fields? What are you going to do personally to prepare for the board? What are you going to do personally to engage more with different types of trustees? And again, I think that's the challenge. It's not to say the boards will communicate more. I mean, sure, but actually saying what this means is that each person will go to at least 3 events that Catherine's just described, and it's something like that, yeah? So I think putting personal actions on there as well is great. And I love this idea of that, being a trustee is really satisfying and fulfilling experience. I mean, governance is always satisfying, let's be honest about this, but what does satisfying look like to each board member?
Yeah.
Because for some of the people that I work with, satisfying means, feeling that they can support young people in leadership. For some of it, it's about giving back to an organisation that was important for them as an alum. What does satisfying look like for each board member? And if we don't know that, how on earth can we ensure that the board's experience is kind of satisfying if we don't know what satisfying looks like?
Yeah, and I think the other thing with that is going back to the first point about the challenge and accepting that people's ability to challenge each other will be different. And if you are a chief exec in the room, one of your roles is to support and enable and empower those trustees who feel less able to challenge for whatever reason, to be able to do that. And that's about actively encouraging that and talking about it openly and accepting challenge yourself when you're challenged, as I'm sure you often are. I'm in that room maybe more times than you would like to be. But yeah, that really links to the fact that people's experience, people's expectations are different, but that also means that their confidence in being able to contribute will be different as well. Cool, so this is now me. Diversity was a really difficult one to distill down because all of the points that it was making at the excellent level was super important. So I've tried to squish them down. Where we lack diversity, we've got clear trustee recruitment targets. And it's a really common question. Nick and I did a session earlier today about the anti-racist board, and people were like, are we allowed to actively recruit for different types of individuals to be on our trustee board? Yes, you are. It's important. And particularly here, going beyond the legal minimum, like it's a legal minimum. It's not a benchmark. Do more than what you're expected to do, where appropriate, in order to rectify a lack of diversity based on your skills and your diversity audits, and using them together. Really good conversation about diversity audits have been secondary in many cases historically in student unions to skills audits, and actually they're having them as a parity and giving them equal weight actually really helps. Having a formal recruitment process, and this is so important, that it includes elections. It's not just about appointment processes, but it doesn't mean you have to use a recruiter. It just means that you've got a clear and established process which gives you the best chance of getting diverse people in. Having said that, some people have found excellent responses from using a recruiter or from pooling into now give something back or similar. People have found that that's been helpful to have a broader range of recruitment practices. This next one I find really interesting. The chair regularly asking for feedback on how meetings can be more accessible, and that things have been removed in terms of obstacles. If your president is your chair, and even if they're not, this can be incredibly difficult to do. You've got to sit there after a meeting or write an email after a meeting and say, tell me how I can make things better. And that's really hard to do. And it's really hard for people to actively respond to that in a constructive way that is meaningful and is taken correctly. So again, if you are a staff member in the room and you're supporting a board, I would really ask you to think about how you can play a role in encouraging that and supporting that. One of the things that I do is that I do some board coaching and facilitation of 30 minutes post board meeting, which is just trustees and me dialing in on the phone, and I facilitate that conversation for the first couple of conversations to get people into the habit of asking the questions and feeling comfortable giving those responses. Sometimes the giving of the feedback is actually harder than asking for it in the first place. Our trustees are all able to participate and find the experience rewarding and fulfilling and it's exactly what Nick was talking about in the previous slide. You've got to ask them what that looks like for them in order to know that you do that. And then you've got to ask them afterwards, was it okay? So conduct exit interviews with your trustee board, particularly if you end up in a situation where half your board leaves in one go. It's not uncommon in student unions when you've got 4 or 5 officers leaving at the same time. You might have coincidentally 1 or 2 lay trustees and 1 or 2 student trustees. You can quite comfortably lose half your board very quickly, and not learning from their experiences is a real shame. It's a lost opportunity. Monitoring the diversity as a board, the only way you can do the first one is to do that one, and make public our approach to recruiting diverse trustees. So it's more than just the statement of, we look to appoint people from diverse backgrounds and, all that kind of nice language that people put in adverts. This is about saying it's a statement of intent. We're doing this for these reasons. We believe that diverse boards make better decisions because they do. And we, because of that, we are actively looking to make sure that we continuously have a really, truly diverse board reflected.
Sorry, Kat, do you mind just to make a quick point on the board diversity issue as well? Yep. The other thing is that I think, we are privileged in students' unions that we have lots of diversity because of the nature of the fact that half of our board are students and elected. And I don't think we should rely on that. So if you're going, well, okay, so our lay trustees look like one group of individuals homogeneously, and about our student trustees each year are a range, actually you can't rely on the democratic process each year. And so actually I would say that it's worth looking at diversity of each of these sections. We talked a bit about this in the anti-racist board earlier on, but I think that's an important thing to bear in mind as well. Yeah,
couldn't agree more. Okay, openness and accountability. So again, some of these, this last slide actually is very much built on the rest of them. We actively seek the views of students, like research all the time. But like it's not just a once a year, not just a once every 3 years. It's actively, continuously seeking the views of students on all kinds of things. The board ensures a clear communication of how we've resolved legal and financial issues, and with democratic bodies if the need arises. Again, when I am working with unions where there's been a disconnect between the trustee board and the senior democratic decision-making body of the student union, it is typically been amplified by a lack of communication between those two things. So these mythical beings over here in the trustee board have their conversation, they make a decision, and then it's communicated back to the council or the Senate or whatever the body is that's made the decision by either one officer on their own, like sent out to slaughter, or in an email or on a statement on the website. And that's not communication, that's just telling some people some stuff that whether it lands or not, you don't really care. And that's how it must feel like if it lands. But equally, it goes the other way around. So if the board are only hearing decisions that, council have decided to boycott Nestle, I don't know, whatever it is they decided to do, and there's no context for that decision, there's no what were the arguments for, what was the rationale, how close was it, there's no context for it. The board are making a decision without all the information as well. So it works both ways.
And just to say that one as well, if you don't mind, Catherine, is the other thing is that if the board only ever hears bad news, it's unhelpful. So if the only time the board's ever involved themselves with student council is when student council have done something which requires the board to make a ruling or intervene, then it appears that all the student council do is cause trouble, which maybe they do, but hopefully they're causing trouble for lots of other people, mainly the university. But actually, like, if that's the perception, then that's become a problem. Do you know what I mean? So if that's the you ever see them, so.
Yeah, definitely. Which leads on to the next one. So the AGM, and I was going to say not just the AGM, but your AGM is a vibrant meeting that really involves students holding us to account, learning from mistakes and improving student union's performance. If anybody has an AGM like that, if you can pop that in the chat right now and I'll come and visit you next time you do one. Because it's so difficult. I mean, even the name, it's really exclusive language. It's an acronym in its own right. It has connotations of really boring meetings, looking at accounts, and you've got to do all that. but looking at them in a different way, in the same way that Nick was talking about your board meeting looking differently, having different conversations around the table. And it's the same thing at an AGM. Hold roundtable discussions, use Google Docs and flip charts and whiteboards or whatever it is you've got access to in your union to take notes from these students about what interests them, what they want to do next. Don't restrict it by making it this super formal meeting that sits in a lecture theatre. And genuinely holding us to account. Well, who's us? Us is the board. So if the board only appears once a year, challenging that person who's sitting there, you know, saying, hi, I'm on the board and I'm an accountant, that must be very difficult for students to be able to do. That's not going to help them actually hold account. They might challenge, they might ask difficult questions, but they might not ask constructively difficult questions. And it's certainly not going to improve the student union's performance. And then having a strong public profile, I really thought about this quite a lot, because often people think that means looking good in papers and it has to be all shiny and pretty and lovely and wonderful. And I don't think that it's that at all. It's the strong public profile is that people know what you stand for. They believe that you can do things, that you can change things. And that's what enables you to exert real influence. So students believe that you can affect change with the university. The residents association, because you've listened to them about their concerns and you've acted on them, and you've negotiated meetings with student residents and non-student residents, and they've had conversations and learnt about each other. They then go, okay, we can have conversations, we can take on bad housing conditions or whatever it is. Those kind of things is what I feel that this excellent level means about that strong public profile. It's confidence in your ability as a charity to get things done. Nick, did you want to jump in on that one?
Just the only two things is, again, this kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier on about integrity. And your strong public profile is also about showing that you are an organisation with integrity. And so, we talked about this again with some other things. But for example, there's openness and accountability of saying we got stuff wrong sometimes, or we have these issues. Let's do this better. I mean, that's also kind of part of openness and accountability and that public profile. The other thing I also talk about openness again. I'll talk about this in relation to the Nolan principles with our trustees and induction. But you've got a duty to be open to each other as a board. Yeah. And there's a point, and that's back a bit to, explaining that things aren't going the way you want them to, or you're worried about stuff or whatever. I think that's also a thing. And it's not just openness with the student body, it's openness on the boards and with senior managers as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, with noticing who we've got in the room, the number of chief execs in the room that can empower that conversation by being open about, sometimes chief execs have a feeling that they've got to say everything's great, and that's the board can't make decisions if they think that everything's great when it's not. So being able to confidently bring things to the table and say, actually, do you know what, we're stuck here, the strategies are going to have to change, or this particular objective that we've got is going to have to move. I mean, we're all living in crisis at the moment. People going, strategy out the window. Like, imagine if you just pretended everything was fine. Sure, we're just going to next board meeting, everything's totally fine, we'll just deal with lockdown, it's no problem. People wouldn't expect that. So making sure that that's role modelled as well, I think, is really helpful. This, I have to say, I can take credit for this particular pun. Get on your bike was mine. So the wheel's there. So how can you get on your bike, Nick?
Cool. I went to university with Norman Tebbett's grandson. There you go. So he ran for SU office. He didn't get elected. So first boards, here are some things that you might want to ask at your next board. So first of all, what are the behaviours we want to exhibit to allow challenge and discussion this year? So asking your board that, think about what they can do in that field. What practical things are needed so that all trustees can be transparent democratic processes, be confident their decisions are informed by them? It's the two-way thing. What can you do practically to ensure that trustees aren't these mythical beings behind an emerald curtain, but also they know that their decisions can be bounced back over the democratic processes? Catherine?
No, that's fine.
I thought you were muted. That's fine. Again, what's the satisfying trustee experience feel like for me personally? And also, what do I need from others to feel it? So for some lay trustees, for example, they might say, well, that means that I want a officer or a student to show me around campus. That happened with one of my clients. It could be, a satisfying experience feels that I think that you respect me.
Yeah.
Or a satisfying experience is one where I don't feel like I'm stupid when I don't understand something. Yeah. What does that look like? It will vary from person to person. And lastly, of course, what are our values? And I mean that as an organisation, but also as a board. But what's our shared explanation of integrity? Like, if we all want to show integrity, that does mean different things to lots of different people. And to have some shared understanding of this about how we're going to approach it is really helpful. So let's pop that in right at the start of the year, because your board's going to change each year. So you need to ask these questions regularly. Cool. And the other thing just about reinventing the wheel, and this suggestion is, and something that I'm going to try with some of my clients, is the idea that we reallocate one spoke of the wheel to each board meeting. So at the end of the board meeting, you send out a survey for the next meeting spoke. So at the end of meeting, so you might discuss foundation at meeting 1, but you might talk about purpose at meeting 2. So you then send out them to ask about that. It then comes back, and you just need to spend 10 minutes in small groups talking about, say, organisational purpose and suggesting actions. Feed those back, and then the chair and CEO create a plan to be implemented. So you've got this constant review process. Like Catherine, with all my boards, I recommend they have a small time at the end of each board saying, how was that for you, basically. So similarly, you go, so the will's not something you get out once a year. It's something that you're talking about constantly all the time for just 10-15 minutes for your boards, and it gives them the mindset of constant development and being excellent and improving, but it keeps them focused on those things as well.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. The charity governance code is in the middle of a review at the moment. The consultation is closed, and they are sharing the findings of that consultation in 3 weeks' time. NCBO are doing a webinar on it if you want to sign up for it. I think it'll be really interesting. But one of the things that I fed back was around the usability of the whole code. Like, when you try and talk to unions about it, I mean, we've whistled through and we've taken out loads of bits of it, and we've only looked at excellent level. We haven't explored the whole thing. It's for a board and the levels of commitment that you're asking from your trustees. It's almost impossible to practically use it unless you take it apart and do it segment by segment. So this is why we're suggesting this as an approach, and to make it real and usable and tangible. And that's it. You'll be pleased to know we're done. The last thing for us today is to get in touch if you want more information or you want to chat more about any of these things. Our details are there. I'm not in any rush to head off, so I'm going to hang on to the call. So it's Nick for a few minutes. If anybody wants to stay and have a chat, I'll just leave these up for a little bit. And if people want to stay, they're very welcome to. If not, have a lovely rest of your evening and enjoy Friday. Thanks very much for coming.
Cheers, all.
Have reactivated it so you can unmute your mics if you want to speak to Catherine or Nick.
Or not, there's no obligation to.
Hi guys, just quick question. You talk about how to make sure the board getting the students' opinions at all times throughout the year. How do you make sure that isn't so directed onto the student trustees and particularly the officers and the execs on the board, particularly if they're new onto the board, that actually they've got the ability to be able to speak up, and it's not sort of shown, and those views are still shown on the board fully. It's not laid down to 1 or 2 people on that board.
Cool. So Benjamin, remind me, do you have student trustees at DSU, or is it just the officers?
Yeah. We have 4, I think, student trustees. Hope that's right.
So there's a few things here. So I think that actually this is where we can use student trustees better in terms of not taking all that. So officers don't have to take all of that weight on. So student trustees can be some of that link between some of that link between the democratic process. That process in terms of policy and representation and the board. So they can do that. So it's not just on the officers to take that on. In terms of them feeling valued, I do think this is about agreeing the shared approach by the board at the start of the year and talking about that and making sure that people understand, like, what the different groups are coming from, and trying to avoid idea of conflict of these are different groups kind of working, separately at best and apart at worst. But actually, as you know, that I said a lot to you during the kind of induction, that, all trustees have the same kind of responsibility and level, and that therefore that respect needs to be kind of set out clearly at the start of the year. So I do think some of that's about that initial setting of kind of where everyone is.
I think the other thing as well, and again, I think we talked about this in the previous session, Ben, was about not feeling that any student data that you get, any research that you get, means that you're treating students as this homogenous group of people who only think one way about everything. And for student trustees, that their lived experience is one of the reasons that they're on the board, and that it's okay for them to vocalise that. If it's in contradiction with data and research, and that's where I do see an awful lot of tension that happens, well, that's not my experience, is to look at that. And is that because the demographics of the people you were researching are very different from the people who are the student trustees? And is that causing a difference in that feedback? Is it because, and this is usually what happens, is that the people on the trustee board have experienced something quite negative, and therefore that's kind of why they want to stand to change something, to make a difference in their union. It tends to be more internally focused. And that's legitimate for them to say, well, my experience was negative, and that's okay, and for them to be accepted and valued for that difference of opinion without detracting from the data itself, which is obviously really important. And it doesn't mean you can't have the conversation. It's just remembering that students aren't this uniform group of people who think one way about everything. Cool. Any other questions? Graham.
Hi, yeah, just probably an extension of what Benjamin was saying. Hello, Catherine. Hello, Nick. Yeah, we have historically really struggled from Highlands and Islands students, I shouldn't say, with student trustees, and the feedback we get overwhelming from them is that they don't feel that they have meaningfully contribute. You know, when they leave, they say they've enjoyed it. It's been fun. It's great to have it on their CV. But they always, almost without fail, say they don't feel they've contributed. And I think that's, you know, when you're in those intense discussions, you know, the sabbaticals obviously know everything about the SU, and the externals are experts in their field. And I think the student trustees just feel a little bit lost. So I guess, I know you've sort of maybe answered it already, but maybe if you could unpick that a bit more, and if you've got any hints and tips for making those student trustees feel particularly valued. And what's interesting is that we don't necessarily feel that they are not contributing, but if they feel that way, then, you know, we've got work to do.
Yeah, and for me, it is that perception as opposed to their actual contribution that is almost always the challenge. Typically, I've done quite a lot of exit interviews recently, and interestingly, they feel overwhelmingly that subcommittees, they find that they are super valued. Bizarrely, when they are actually quite niche and sometimes quite specialist expert, you know, finance and risk committees and those kind of things, which are quite technical in their format. So it's not the technical stuff that's getting to them. It's where their voices are lost in the conversation. There's definitely a role for the chair, for me, in that situation, to play a major role in making sure not just that everyone gets a turn, which I know lots of people talk about, but that the time that they're given, that the space they're given, and the validity of what they're saying is recognised and acknowledged. I think there's a role for staff to play in terms of supporting. Lots of senior staff do pre-meets with officers and with student trustees, but student trustees tend to be left off the pipeline because they haven't got control of the diary in the same way as the officers do, and you know, lectures get in the way, and let's face it, that's what they're there to do. So prioritising them in terms of that informal conversation to make sure people feel that they've understood the papers and understood their own viewpoint on that, and they feel able to articulate that. And to encourage that, but also, you know, what Nick and I were saying about changing the way that your board meetings run, so that they're not always round a board meeting, that very formal university governors kind of, I'm straight doing it, kind of approach to things. If you don't always do that, and your discussions are more small groups, roundtable, chatting conversations about things that matter, but they don't always have to be in that really formal setting. Again, some different types of, not just student trustees, loads of different types of trustees find those really valuable to be able to contribute in a more meaningful way to themselves, to feel like that. And one last thing before I let Nick actually talk, is one of the things that I found fascinating from the feedback from exiting student trustees was the number of them who said that they weren't formally thanked. And I thought that was a really interesting, that these were not from unions that had dreadful experiences. They were not, in a negative. It was just oh, by the way, as they were kind of leaving, we never got a thank you card. We never got an email from anybody. The VC doesn't know who I am. Like just those little things that just demonstrate that they are actually valued. A ticket to the awards dinner, a ticket to varsity, and an invitation to come to the Christmas meal that the staff are doing, whatever it is that you're offering.
Nice, cool. I think not much to add to that. I mean, what I would say is I don't think anyone's got student trustees right, and I mainly blame myself for this. In that, when I was at NUS, we were doing boards for the first time in this format. We were really focused on these lay trustees who people thought were going to be these evil people taking over students' unions. We were trying to win that argument basically, and then we kind of forgot. And we knew officers were officers, and that was fine. We kind of forgot about the student trustees, and then kind of time ran out. So I think partly that's one of the reasons that we didn't think about this enough in 2007. And fine, but I
don't think you can take responsibility for the whole movement, though, Nick.
but I do think there are things like when we gave templates for stuff, we didn't think about student trustees in the context of those templates. So the classic one is, if your skills audit basically says, how are you at finance, but doesn't ask about understanding the student experience, then that's a problem, isn't it? So you're focusing it on normal trustee boards and not your own values. And I think those are the things that are really important. And that's, so it's that kind of stuff. If you set your dates for the year based on people's availability for lay trustees, but you don't remember that your students aren't going to get their timetable until 2 weeks before the start of term, so you might need to change it all, that's an issue as well. So it's those sorts of things you need to think about, I think, to make people feel kind of part of the board.
Yes.
I'd absolutely do that. And the other thing, I've given this example, the board's research that I did a couple of years ago now. One of the things I recommended was that you should give each lay member a mentor who's a student trustee. Yes. So they get a student trustee to say, why don't you spend a day with me and see what my student experience is like? Or why don't people often you get a sense of the student experience directly. It's a bit more difficult Highlands and the Islands, I appreciate that, but actually going, this is the person that is your go-to to say, well, what is it like being a student today? Because that has shifted. I mean, that shifts so quickly that it's really important to capture as well.
Yeah. Does that help, Graham?
Yeah, no, absolutely. There's lots of little tidbits there. It was quite interesting. The first thing you said, Catherine, about student trustees feeling more meaningful on subcommittees. That's really interesting. I'll have to go away and have a look at that data. But no, that was really, really helpful. And we haven't actually looked at sort of that almost sort of mentor relationship, Nick. So that's definitely something we'll look at as well. Thank you.
Right.
No worries. Has anybody else got anything they want to add, or any new thoughts of train of thought or questions? No, we'll just leave instead.
It's always charming when that happens, isn't it?
Oh, sorry, I still had it on. Didn't realise. Must go.
Brilliant. Okay, great. In that case,
that's great, Leah. Thank you very much for attending. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick and Catherine, for a very insightful. There's definitely a lot I can take away from starting to look at some governance-y stuff. So thank you for that. A lot of food for thought. So that's the last session for Thursday. Check out the website for sessions for Friday, which is our last day in SU's 20 Digital. I hope you've enjoyed the rest of the week that's already gone, and you can watch all of the replays back as well. Thank you both again.
Cheers.
Bye.
So, thank you very much, Catherine, Nick.
Game show wave.